Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I'm really glad to have you with me. I want to talk about a story about a couple in Venezuela that is joining this exodus from the country. And the reason I find the story particularly fascinating, there's several reasons why I find the story fascinating. One, I have a personal connection. The gentleman that does the technical production of Michael Brown Unplugged, as you may know, I've told you before, lives in Caracas. And, I'm certainly not going to mention his name or where he works or anything else. But he plans to flee the country, move to another country, get established, and eventually move girlfriends, family, others to this other country. And the stories that he and I have exchanged, that he has told me about not having power and not being able to do certain things and watching some of the protests from his window, my heart goes out to him. And my heart goes out to him because you and I, yesterday on the radio program, day before yesterday on the radio program, I spent a lot of time talking about the Hong Kong protests and why those protests were about liberty and freedom. And that I was attracted to the protests when a Hong Kong cop or a Chinese army official, I'm not sure which, at point blank range shot one of the protesters. And many of the comments in response to that video were, well, it appears to us that the protester, the rioter, whatever word they used, you could tell that was their mental assessment of what I'm calling the protester, others called rioters. And I think that is a distinction with a difference, because I believe that the majority of these protesters are actually trying to figure out a way to preserve the freedom and the liberty that they have in Hong Kong. Anytime you have a revolution where it is freedom and liberty on the one hand, that's facing a statist government, a tyrannical government on the other hand, and I don't care what label you put on that tyrannical government. It can be a socialist government. It can be a Marxist government. It can be a fascist government. It can be a communist government. They are all statist, centrally planned, tyrannical governments. And actually, they just move in progression from socialism to Marxism to fascism to communism. So anytime that you have this clash between freedom-loving, liberty-loving individuals and those who want to impose their will through government, who want to take away freedom and liberty, it is inevitable that at some point there's going to be a physical, violent clash. Those who don't understand American history forget that this country was founded on violence. We declared our independence. We listed our grievances against King George. And then a small but powerful group of, a minority group of colonists took it upon themselves to engage in a battle against the Redcoats, against the British Army, the most powerful army on earth at the time, and they succeeded. So as I watch these Hong Kong protesters, I understand that inevitably there's going to be a violent clash and people are going to die on both sides. That's the nature of having a protest when it's freedom and liberty versus tyranny. But let's go back to Venezuela. Jonathan Morales and Delanio Loyo were ready to leave. Mr. Morales is a 26-year-old chef. he had hidden his life savings of $150 inside the waistband of his underwear. Ms. Loyo, a 23-year-old nurse, had a grilled eggplant for the trip packed up by her grandmother. All they carried was 2 backpacks and a borrowed suitcase. Already 24 members of their families had abandoned Venezuela. The remaining relatives, who were very old and couldn't travel, came to see them off on that day earlier this summer. They took group photos, they cracked jokes to ease their sadness. They had their visas to Chile in hand. So this young couple took their seats on a bus to the Colombian border. A lot of the fellow passengers, who also hoped to leave for good, were traveling without documents. And they were facing a 22-hour ride to get to the border. Now, once the bus departed, a man stood up saying he was from the transportation company. He warned everybody that soldiers tend to board along the route and to extort the riders. So he urged the riders to scatter their money and valuables inside their clothes and luggage. He advised some of them to pretend to be mute. These migrants are a frequent target of soldiers, and his job was simply to guide the passengers to border crossings and help them with paperwork, which could attract unwanted attention. If any soldiers get on board, he said, you don't know me, they'll throw me in jail. Do you realize that more than 4 million Venezuelans have left their country? It is the largest migration crisis in modern Latin America history. And if you think we think about, okay, we're going to leave the United States. We're going to sneak off to Canada or Mexico, or we're going to jump on a plane in Denver International Airport or wherever, and we're going to fly to, I don't know, Japan. We're going to fly to Spain. We're going to fly to the UK. We're going to fly to Thailand. It's easy for us. It's not easy for them. It's difficult. Maduro has tightened up migration policies. And so a lot of Venezuelans are forced to take illegal paths. They pay off gangs at the borders. Soldiers will rob them of clothes, take their money. They get extorted. And those who leave probably don't have very much money for food and housing. And then just finding work is difficult. There's actually xenophobia generated by the mass migration that has spawned these bouts of vigilante justice in Brazil, Peru, and other places where these Venezuelans try to go to rebuild their lives. So these two, Mr. Morales and Miss Loyo, made it a priority of getting out. They started dating 3 years ago. They were both working as nurses in eastern Caracas. They were helping save the lives of gunshot victims, heart attack patients, protesters left bloodied by Maduro's troops during the anti-government demonstrations. But they were struggling to survive on salaries that could barely pay for a pound of cheese every month. So the day before the bus trip, Mr. Morales went to the cemetery with a rag and a bottle of soapy water, and he washed the headstone over the grave of his teenage brother, Johnny, who had been shot dead by gangsters 4 years ago. He says in an article in the Wall Street Journal that everything just screams that I got to get out of here. Think about living someplace your entire life and then deciding that it is so bad that you have to get up and leave. Think about going to school, getting your nursing degree, the joy of getting that degree and then doing the profession that you love, but then finding that you can't make enough money doing that. And even if in America, we find ourselves that if you can't make enough money in one job, you take other jobs, you take 2 jobs, you take 3 jobs, you do whatever you need to do. But in Venezuela, it didn't make any difference. One, there weren't other jobs. And even if you could make enough money, that didn't mean that there was enough food for you to go buy. And as my friend, who's probably listening to this podcast right now, would tell me, sometimes he didn't get the podcast done because there wasn't power or he was too tired. We don't know how good we have it in this country. So this couple applied for visas back in 2018. And every morning for 10 months, Mr. Morales, he'd log into the Chilean embassy website and check for confirmation that their applications were in process, and then he'd refresh the page throughout the day. And that even became a challenge. You know, you and I get on the website, and if our Comcast internet goes down, or our Verizon Fios goes down, or any other sort of ISP that we use, if it goes down more than 2 minutes, we're screaming at the company, and of course the company's scrambling to fix it as quickly as possible. That's not the case in Venezuela. So as they try to refresh the page off and on all the time to see if their applications for their visas have been approved, they may have to wait hours, if not days, before they can go refresh the page again. So back in January, the United States, and a bunch of other countries too, not just us, declared that the legitimate leader of Venezuela was the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, not Maduro. Maduro's regime had just collapsed the economy. Anyway, last April, Mr. Morales got an email from the Chilean embassy that their visa application had been approved. Now, of course, they were excited, but that was tempered by the fact that they didn't have any money to pay for the trip. And that's where Peggy Christian, a 58-year-old Venezuelan exile that lives right here in Denver, came in. Ms. Christian had been working with Mr. Morales caring for a hospice patient in Caracas before she fled to the United States on a visa 2 years ago. She's among the almost 43,000 medical personnel, nurses, doctors, hospital technicians that these different advocacy groups say have abandoned Venezuela. So this lady here in Denver kept in touch with Mr. Morales. When he told her about his ordeal, she offered them a loan to pay for the trip to Santiago. She said that she sets aside some of her savings to help former colleagues, even as she deals with her own challenges here in the United States. She's been unable to obtain a certified copy of her diploma from Caracas, so she hasn't been able to work as a nurse in the United States. So instead, she's working here as a nurse's assistant, which pays about half as much as she would get if she could prove that she had actually graduated from nursing school in Caracas. She told the Wall Street Journal that it breaks her heart every day trying to help this young couple. So she spent about $800 to help this couple, purchasing bus tickets to the border of Colombia, and then flights to Bogota, on to Lima, and then finally on to Santiago. The Brookings Institution estimates that the number of Venezuelan migrants could double to about 8 million in the next 2 years, far more than the 6 million who fled war-ravaged Syria. And think about that. That's all we hear in the news are about Syrian refugees. We're not hearing anything, at least that I can find. There's nothing in the mainstream media. The Wall Street Journal has done the story about this couple. But other than that, you don't hear anything. And I can't figure out why. Because if we're going to be concerned, and I understand that Bashar Assad is a despicable human being committing atrocities against his own citizens in Syria. Maduro is doing the same thing. He's just doing it by collapsing the economy and making it difficult, if not impossible, to make a living, to feed themselves, to house themselves. He's doing the same thing in Venezuela. And let's just stop and think about that for a second. How many times have I tried to remind everybody that the history of mankind is a history of people living under horrific conditions, under the subjugation of tyrannical leaders who want to control the population, where they live, how they live, where they go, when they go, what they eat, everything. They want to control the population. That's the very nature of a tyrannical government. And that's the nature of most of the world's history. The United States is unique in that regard, and I think we fail way too often to recognize that uniqueness. And I also think it gives us, now look, I want to be very specific here. The United States cannot take, if the Brookings Institution is correct, if Brookings is estimating that the number of Venezuelan migrants could double to 8 million in the next 2 years, we can't take all 8 million in this country any more than we can take the 6 million from Syria, or that we can take all of the millions that come up from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and the Central American countries. We need an immigration system that is fair, but that limits the number of migrants that come to this country, because we simply cannot take all of these people in. But I think we do have an obligation, and I want to be specific and careful in my language here. I think the obligation we have, yes, we provide foreign aid through the government. Yes, we provide military aid when it's appropriate. And the government does those things that we can argue whether it's good or bad, whether it's money well spent or not well spent. But you know what we can do? It's just like I say that you and I have a personal responsibility to help those less fortunate. Liberals, statists, want to take away our compassion and put that compassion on the federal government. They think that the government should do all of those things that I believe that you and I as individuals have a responsibility to do. If that is doing what this lady in Denver did, simply finding one couple, one person, and doing what she can, actually stretching well beyond her means to spend $800, you and I can do that too. And I think if you and I, as individuals, made it a priority to find whatever organization, and look, I've told you before that Tamara sponsors children through World Vision. That's her choice. That's her money. She does it. It makes her feel good, and I know that what she does is helping somebody in another country. Her passion is children. I think you and I should figure out what our passion is. And I think you and I should figure out a way, whether it's somebody from Venezuela, somebody from Central America, somebody from Syria, somehow. It doesn't mean that we have to sponsor them and bring them to the United States. They may not want to come to the United States. They may want to go somewhere else. But I think you and I have an obligation, not as the government, but as citizens of the greatest and most powerful and the most wealthy country in the world. We have a responsibility. Doesn't make any difference what our faith is. Doesn't make any difference whether we're Christian, Jew, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, whatever it is. It just doesn't make any difference. I just want to point out, and this is going to be a short podcast, but I wanted to take this story of this couple as a jumping off point to remind us as Americans that while we live sometimes dumb, fat, and happy, there are people struggling for a better life all over the world. I know there are people struggling in this country to live a better life. So let's make a choice. Whether it's a couple in Venezuela, a couple in Syria, a couple from Central America, a couple from wherever, maybe it's somebody here. But what you and I should do is recognize that not only as conservatives, libertarians, that we don't want the government doing all of these things, you and I can do something. Look, your internet service isn't going to go out. And because you're listening to a podcast, I know you have access to the internet. You got a smartphone, you got a tablet, you got a desktop, you got a laptop. Somehow you're connecting to the internet. So that means you've got a search engine. Now, you know I don't like Google, but you got DuckDuckGo, you got Bing, you've got something. Somewhere, somehow, you can find a way to start searching different organizations like World Vision, or you can start talking among your sphere of influence, your friends and your neighbors. They may know somebody that knows somebody. There's 6 degrees of separation. Use those 6 degrees of separation. I pray for my friend who wants to leave. I also want to figure out a way that I can start being like this woman in Denver. You know, let me be honest. As I read through the story, it was in Wednesday's Wall Street Journal. As I read through the story, I was just kind of half-heartedly reading it, and then I came across the part where the Wall Street Journal starts talking about this Venezuelan exile in Denver, working as a nurse's assistant, doing what she can to help her fellow citizens. And it made me feel guilty. It made me feel guilty because I look at what Tamara's doing, I look at what this woman is doing, I look at what other friends are doing, and I think to myself, I could do more. You and I are so lucky. We're so lucky to live in this country. And I know that at times, all of us, every single one of us, struggle financially for whatever reason. We're still better off than most of the rest of the world. Whether it's Venezuela, Central America, Syria, we don't have to sponsor somebody and bring them to the United States, but we can find ways to help. And so that's my challenge. Let you and I find a way to help those who don't live in liberty and freedom, who live in tyranny, and simply want to find a way to improve their lives. I think the founding fathers, I think God wants us to do that. Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I know it was unusual, but it was something that was both in my mind and in my heart, and I hope you consider it. I'll talk to you tomorrow.